Okay, so a few things that I'm going to expand on from Colossians chapter 7 on race, ethnicity, and social class. One of the early questions asks regarding the size of the Native American population prior to contact, and what are the implications of this? Well, there's a couple things. The larger the population level was, the more we have to acknowledge how sophisticated their agricultural methods must have been to be able to sustain large populations. Another implication is that the larger the Native American population was, then the larger the loss due to contact, conquest, and colonization was. And so historically, it's just been convenient to undercount Native Americans or lessen the size of their population. And so hence these past ideas of, they were essentially hunters and gatherers. Yeah. And I'm not going to talk about their agricultural methods. There's going to be a week when we focus on significantly more on agriculture. But again, it's just this gives us the idea of how they had their own unique agricultural methods that were highly productive. Then we get introduced to the question of the Western Highlands people and the advanced civilizations. And so and I think I used to have it where the question asked for 4. This time I expanded it. So the advanced Western Highland advanced civilizations were the Aztecs, the Maya, the Chibcha, also known as Muisca, and I'll talk about them after this list because we haven't talked about them before. The Inca that we know refer to themselves as the Tehuantinsuyo, not the Chichimex or the Toltecs. A lot of students wrote Chichimex or Toltecs in their answers for homework. So this would be the first 4. Then number 5 would be the Southern Andean Indians, which were less advanced than these first 4. And number 6 would be the Kono, the Alakaluf, and the Yagan, the least advanced of all of these. And here's where you can see them, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, the Chibcha, and then down here, we have these other ones, the Araucanian, Chono, Alakaluf, and so forth. A little bit more regarding number 5 and 6, especially number 5. So the Southern Andean Indians are specifically include the Mapuche, Pecunche, Huiliche, Pehuenche. They're less advanced, yet one of the reputations of, say, the Mapuche in modern-day Chile is that they are one of the groups that was historically the most successful at fighting off the Spanish and never fully conquered. And till this day, they're still remembered and recognized for their, their rebellious fighting spirit. Again, to answer what are some characteristics of Western Highlands people, especially in comparison to Eastern Lowlands people, Western Highland were more densely populated and were the most highly advanced civilizations. Eastern Lowlands, lower population density and more modest social organization and material achievement. with regard to Native American, but specifically Mayan astronomical calculations. There's a couple examples here. One is their lunar month differed from our modern mathematical calculation by just 33.7 seconds. And so, yeah, their knowledge of astronomy 1,000 years ago, was at the level, very close to the level, in some cases even more advanced than what we use today. The revolution of, or more accurate than what we use today. The revolution of Venus, for example, had an error of only 1 hour and 55 minutes every 584 days. The Mayan calendar and the Aztec sunstone, essentially their calendar was more accurate than the European Julian calendar that was used at the time of contact. And it's even slightly more accurate than the Gregorian calendar that we've been using since 1582. And now, granted, it's very small higher accuracy. It's only 1/10,000th of a day. But still impressive for people that we put down for hundreds of years as unsophisticated, unknowledgeable, primitive people. This is what's left of the Mayan observatory to study astronomy. The Muisca or Chibcha is one of the groups we haven't talked about before. I think Clausen uses Chibcha. Chibcha is actually the name of their language. I think a better term would be the Muisca Confederation. And this confederation, sort of Native Americans that were part of this Muisca Confederation were in Colombia, northern Ecuador, eastern Central America. And one of the things they're remembered for is their gold work. And so they made a lot of things out of gold. And this is also the group of people from which we get the myth of El Dorado, especially in Colombia. And this is one place where people went looking for it. Lake Guatavita, this is that lake at the top of like a volcano. And one of their traditions, one of their ceremonies they would do there is the ruler would go there and make offerings to a goddess. And they would, these offerings would be a lot of gold that was dumped into the lake as gifts to this goddess. And it's also believed that they would do it in this way. There would be a gold-plated raft, and the people would be entirely gold-plated in order to do this ceremony. And then they would dump a bunch of gold into the lake. And so that's where the myth of El Dorado comes from. And you can see here how someone got here and tried to, imagine kind of the crater at the top of a volcano. And then people try to cut into that crater to let the water out so they can get to the gold at the bottom of the lake. And that's what they did here. They tried to cut the side so that the water would escape and then they can get to the bottom of the lake. When I went to Cartagena, I learned about, I went to a museum focused on gold and the artifacts that one specific group, the Zenu, who was part of this Chibcha speaking Native Americans of that area. And with these examples of intricate goldsmithing that they did. And so these are pictures that I took when I was in Cartagena, Colombia. This is a picture from the book. You recall the Tehuantinsuyo, one of the things they're known for is for their impressive stonework without the use of cement. We get introduced in the book to this concept that as human how's it go? As more and more animals were brought in, the Native American population, human population declined in the Americas. On that note, how significant was the Native American population decline? It is the most massive population decline in the history of all humankind. 90 to 95% died by 1650. That's a loss of between 45 and 95 million people. For sake of comparison, the Holocaust was terrible. And it's often used as one of those examples of one of the greatest tragedies in human history. And so it was terrible. But that tragedy was about 7 million people. And the Native American population decline is between 45 and 95 million. For the question on the Curaca system, you're asked to identify both before, sort of under the Inca, what was the Curaca system like, and then in colonial times, what it was like. And so under the Inca, this was a privileged class. They were often local elites of a conquered region who were rewarded by the Inca for their loyalty. And so the Inca would conquer an area, and then they would get local people of that area to help them administer it. Under colonial times, the Curaca system was about having intermediate administrators who were paid so little that they resorted to extorting fellow Native Americans. We get to slavery. And here we're getting a sense of how many slaves were brought to different parts of the Americas. And the majority were brought to Brazil and to the Caribbean, especially the French, British, Dutch, Danish, and Swedish Caribbean. Not to the United States and not to Spanish America. You're asked a question about the Middle Passage. You're asked about the mortality rate. 50% of these enslaved people would actually die on their way to the Middle Passage, on the way to the ships. And then between 5 and 20% would die in the ships on their way to the Americas. Sugarcane was one of the areas in which they were put to work, and here's a sugar mill. You know, there were all sorts of punishments, ways of controlling people, branding of people, like if they were livestock. And Clausen introduces us to the fact that African slaves in Spanish and Portuguese colonies were supposed to have Roman legal, were supposed to have rights based on Roman legal precedents. Their right to life, they couldn't just be killed. Specific protection for women and children from being abused by their masters. They had the right to own personal property, the right to make their own contracts, the right to purchase their own personal freedom. Manumission, when slaves would be given their freedom by their owner. Then Clausen goes into the free Black population. And Hispanic Latin America's Black population came to be dominated by freedmen, not by slaves. And we're shown these examples where free Blacks outnumbered slaves in Mexico and Panama 9-1. And so most of the Black population was freed, not slaves. In the non-Hispanic Caribbean, freedmen were only 5 to 10% of the Black population. So it was the opposite. You're asked about different types of resistance, slave resistance. There's passive resistance, the use of violence, or escaping. The most common of one of the homework questions asks you which of these was the most common. Passive resistance was the most common. And then on this topic of resistance, capoeira is one example of resistance, specifically in Brazil. So capoeira is this martial art / dance that was practiced by the Black population in Brazil. With African instruments.
Confident Afro-Brazilian cultural practice is very violent and dance. It's comprehended as folklore, sport, and even art. The circle, button, is where the game takes place. The two dimensions are always present. The movement side of the celebration is playfulness, and the other side of resistance and reaction to the oppressive system. The capoeiristas, people who practice capoeira, sing, clap their hands, and play percussion instruments. In the center,
so yeah, when we're gonna see a we're gonna watch a documentary, one of the series in Black and Latin America, the one focused on Brazil. We'll talk more about capoeira. Another example of resistance is Gaspar Yanga. Gaspar Yanga was the name of a formerly enslaved person in Mexico, in Veracruz, Mexico, this place in Mexico that is historically important. The slaves there were put to work in sugar plantations. Gaspar Yanga led a revolt in 1570. He created a community of 550 people that lasted for 30 years. These 550 people were formerly enslaved. Then there was a war in 1609 where 500 soldiers were sent to end the existence of this free community. And in 1618, they ended up winning their freedom. They signed the treaty where in exchange for leaving their community alone, they would agree not to do any raids on the Spanish. This made this settlement the first free Black settlement in the Americas. I'll play you the short 3-minute video about this topic.
The first liberator of the Americas, Gaspar Yanga led one of the most successful slave rebellions in the Americas. During the 16th century, sugar was the main crop in Veracruz. Yanga was among the many slaves brought over from West Africa and forced into work in the Spanish sugar plantations in Mexico. Around 1570, he led a slave revolt and escaped with a group of followers into the mountainous terrain surrounding Veracruz. There, Yanga and his people formed a settlement, which grew to some 550 people and eluded capture for nearly 30 years. This thriving community became a beacon of freedom for other runaway slaves. Yanga and his people survived through agriculture and livestock. They also waged a campaign against Spanish colonial rule, raiding caravans that ran between Veracruz and Mexico City, carrying goods, food, and other supplies. Yanga's raids and the ongoing exodus of Black and indigenous folks in his community upset the Spanish plantation owners. The owners called on the colonial government to take action. In 1609, the Spanish governor sent a military force of 500 men to put an end to Yanga and his group. Opposing that force was Yanga's irregular army armed with firearms, machetes, bows and arrows, and even stones. When Yanga learned of the impending attack, he sent one of his Spanish prisoners to negotiate peace terms. The Spanish, however, had no interest in negotiation, and a brutal battle ensued. Both sides suffered heavy casualties, but the Spanish governor was forced to respect Yanga's strength. Yanga and his survivors retreated higher up into the mountains, out of Spanish reach, and again flourished. After many failed negotiations and military actions, the Spanish opted to negotiate in 1618. Under a treaty, Spain granted freedom to Yanga and his followers in exchange for an end to raids on Spanish caravans. In addition, the former slaves were given land, and Yanga and his family were recognized as the rulers of the community. By 1630, the town of San Lorenzo de los Negros was born, the first free African settlement in the Americas. In 1932, the town was renamed Yanga to honor the courageous man who represented hope and liberty to so many enslaved people. Yanga's courage in the face of danger inspires us all to stand up for our beliefs and freedoms, and we are honored to call him a hero of color.
So yeah, these are a lot of the points made in that video. These are a couple of the last points made in the video. In 1630 it becomes San Lorenzo de los Negros, Veracruz. Since 1932, it's been Yanga, Veracruz. Here's another example of a runaway settlement, this one in Brazil, led by Zumbi and called Quilombo dos Palmares. Runaway settlement in Brazil from 1605 to 1694. Here's a map of Quilombo dos Palmares. Yeah. So led by Zumbi, named Quilombo dos Palmares. Quilombo was one of the terms for runaway slave communities. They were called maroon societies, quilombos, mocambos. Those are all terms for runaway slave communities. All right, racial patterns in Latin America. We have mestizos in a lot of Mexico and Central America. Kind of the lower Andes, the central lowlands, I suppose. The whitest parts of Latin America are Argentina, Uruguay, southern Brazil. The blackest parts of Latin America are the coast of Brazil, the Caribbean coast of much of Mexico, Central America, and South America. And then we have the combination of Black and East Indians. And there we get to the Guianas. And we'll touch on that. All right, some of these terms can be confusing. So let's talk about a little bit of that. When Columbus arrived to the Americas, his goal was to reach Asia, and essentially the spices, to get to the spices of India. And so hence why Native Americans were called Indians. Later on, they figured out that, and they would refer to this area as the Indies, kind of a precursor to Asia. So then they said, okay, well, now we know we're not in Asia, so we're going to call the Caribbean, we're going to call that the West Indies, and we're going to call Asia the East Indies. And so those are, West Indies is an old term for the Caribbean. East Indies is an old term for Asia. Now we call them, we say Asia. And then with regard to indentured servants, basically when Latin American countries started getting rid of slavery, some of those countries started replacing the slaves with indentured servants from East Asia. And so in particular down here. And so here's an example of sort of the Indian influence in Latin America. And then some information from Clausen. So East Asians were imported to the Caribbean and South America in the 1830s to the 1900s, essentially when they were outlawing slavery. As they outlawed slavery, South Asians were recruited to replace them. Specific groups that recruited them and the places they recruited them from. The French recruited from India. The Dutch brought people from Java and brought them to Suriname. The British brought people from India to Guyana. From India and other South Asian groups to Guyana, to Trinidad, to Jamaica, and other Caribbean colonies. And so it's slaves being replaced by East Asians from some of these places, yeah. Java, India. All right. Then the topic of whitening in Latin America gets brought up. A few things. It's not a surprise that people would try to have upward mobility as much as the caste system would allow them to. But then there were also social policies by governments where they would things that led to the physical whitening of the population. One is 90 to 95% of Native Americans dying. Then there is the Black population not being treated so well. And so them dying or not reproducing. Then there's immigration policies where countries like Brazil and those Southern Cone countries like Argentina, they would openly try to recruit white people from Europe to move to their countries to help their countries become more white. And then there's cultural or social whitening, the history and present of whiteness being associated with power, people trying to pass for the next higher caste or, pass for being as white as they can. And then this idea of people marrying up. And these ideas are embedded in a lot of Latin American culture till this day. People will talk about quote unquote bettering the race. Whenever someone has a significant other that is lighter skinned, a lot of times people will encourage that and talk about, that they are bettering the race. And these are legacies of this colonial period of the caste system, 300 years of a caste system. Now, one of the homework questions in a section in Clausen asks about Indigenismo and Negritude. And I'm asking, why did this happen? Why did it happen the way it did? Clausen is critical of these movements. He basically says things like that they romanticized Indigenous and Black history, that this romanticized history was written by colored elites, people of color that were elites who didn't want to live with the community that they were romanticizing. Just very critical. What Clausen surprisingly is not acknowledging is that, every society deals with its own legacies of its past. And so Latin America was dealing with 300 years of colonization and a caste system, meaning for 300 years, they were told that if you're Black and if you're Indigenous, you are less than. When countries became independent, they tried to create some unique local history that included Native Americans and African Americans in the case of the greater Americas. But a lot of that history had not been written yet. And so they didn't have much to draw from. And so hence, they did poems and songs and, very brief histories. And so, yeah, there's been continued racism in the Americas and Latin America after independence. And again, romanticized because they kind of had to. They didn't have anything else to draw from. And they were trying to go against what they had been told for 300 years, which might be more difficult than we realize. So some Native Americans in Ecuador, Native Americans in Guatemala, Native American women in Mexico, and then this idea in Latin America that what determines whether you're Latin American is what language you speak, how you dress. And so here, and Clausen is sort of alluding to this because he's saying, look at this mother, she's considered Indian, but her son is considered mestizo. And it's not because his father is white, it's just because he's of another generation that is more westernized. You know, dressed in more Western attire as opposed to more Native American attire. I was in a Latin American conference once where a person talking about the Andes of South America said that one of their definitions in the Andes with regard to who's an Indian and who's not is if you have a cell phone, you're no longer Indian. And so again, it's these ideas that Native Americans live in the past or live like non-Westernized people. And whereas we tend to think of it perhaps a little more in terms of kind of ancestry and biology and less about culture. But again, the caste system was not just about biology. The caste system said, if you're Indian, this is how you have to dress. These are the rights you're allowed to have and the ones you're not allowed to have. And if you're mestizo, this is how you dress and so forth. So it's about the legacies of that colonialism continuing.